So I think this afternoon we're just going to have a short talk on writing implementation science grants, and then move into small group to just kind of get some practice with the intervention functions and behavior change techniques, and thinking about what those are from Luke's talk. There was a publication not too long ago about 10 key ingredients to writing implementation science grants, and this was from Enola Proctor, who's one of the leaders in the field. So I'm just going to go through what those are, and then go through a couple examples of grants that we've written that highlight sort of how we incorporate some of these principles into the various components of at least an NIH grant application. All right, so the first principle is the care or quality gap, right? So it should sound familiar. We've talked about gaps, performance gap, or care gap, or quality gaps, outcome gaps all week. So, we're not making this up. These are other people sort of agree with these concepts. And, really what you're trying to say is there clear evidence that a gap exists, right? And this is often put into a significance or impact section of a grant. The next is the evidence-based intervention, right? So this is the evidence that you're trying to translate, right? Is there demonstrated evidence for program intervention, right? That this should be scaled up, that this should be implemented. And so that, again, can go either in the significance or innovation section of your grants. The conceptual model and theoretical justification. Right? So this is a really important part of a grant, and this is one of the most common reasons why implementation science grants are not funded through the NIH, is that they lack a clear theoretical foundation. And so what they're asking is, does the proposal delineate a clear conceptual framework, theory, or model that informs the design and the variables being tested? So both the design and evaluation. And again, this is something that can be incorporated into the approach or innovation section. Stakeholder priorities and engagement. So we talked about community engagement and the importance of doing this. And so they want to know what was the process of engagement to date, and what is the process of engagement going forward. Right? So it's something that needs to go into the grant. The steadiness ready to adopt new services. Right? You have to provide clear information on the context in which you're planning to test implementation. Is this an appropriate context? In addition to our stakeholders engaged, is the setting ready? Is there readiness to move forward with implementation? Right. Number 6 is implementation strategy and process. So the the strategies that you've designed to facilitate implementation. What are they? Are they well justified? Right? How did you use theory and frameworks to select the implementation strategies that you're going to test to facilitate uptake of your intervention? Right? I think this is nice that they highlight implementation strategy. We talk about intervention design, but really to separate the evidence-based intervention that you're translating, right, from the strategy that you're using or proposing to test in order to facilitate uptake. And that strategy is what often referred to as an implementation strategy, sometimes also called the intervention strategy, so it can be confusing. What's the experience of your research team, right, with the setting, right, the intervention, the implementation process, right? Have you worked in this setting, right? Has your team been experienced in understanding the barriers in this particular setting where you're proposing to study your intervention? The feasibility of the proposed research design, right? So what are the methods that you're using? Are they well thought out? If you're using mixed methods, have you explained your rationale for how you're sequencing quantitative and qualitative research and how they're being used together to achieve your scientific goals? All of these things are considered. Measurement and analysis section, I've highlighted this because they want you to clarify how your constructs are being measured, right? So if you're using theory or frameworks to design interventions, right, how is that carrying through to the evaluation process? Right? How are you evaluating whether the constructs you thought were important are actually important or not? And lastly, the policy and funding environment. So does the proposal that you're putting forth, does it align with other ongoing policy and funding or other initiatives that are relevant to the health problem that you're studying and the context in which you're studying them? Okay, so those are the kind of 10 key ingredients. And what they say is that while no application can include a high level of detail about every ingredient, right? This is, you can't, it's only, a lot of these applications are only 8 to 10 pages. You can't put a page on each of these, right? You have other things to write as well. But addressing them, addressing them in some fashion can help assure reviewers of the significance, feasibility, and impact of the proposed research, right? And if you can convince reviewers that your research has significance, feasibility, and impact, right, it's guaranteed to at least get scored and get comments back. And if they have, some comments about your methods or some of your choices, those can all easily be addressed, right? But if reviewers are not convinced of the significance and the feasibility, it's much harder to change that when you sort of revise and resubmit. So I'm going to go over an example of a grant that I wrote along with others in this room, Fred, Jennifer, and Professor Kamya. Fred, I think, presented this as a case study, and so kind of go through in a little bit more detail how we describe different components of that case study in the grant proposal. So this grant was focused on delivering short course TB preventive therapy, and we call it the 3HP options trial. Right, so for ingredient number one, the care or quality gap. Right, so in the specific aims section, right at the beginning of the grant, we write preventive therapy for TB has traditionally consisted of 6 to 9 months of daily isoniazid, although proven to be effective. Right, and recommended, this regimen's long duration and concerns about toxicity have contributed to poor uptake. Right, so we say that right now there's a large gap in the uptake of TB preventive therapy, and we expound on this later on in the grant. In the significance section, we start to give statistics. About 1% of the 19 million people living with HIV have received TB preventive therapy, and we say that completion rates are generally under 50%. Including in Uganda, where among people living with HIV it was only about 60%. Right? So we're immediately establishing what the performance gap is related to the evidence that we want to translate. The evidence-based intervention itself. So again, early on, we start out by saying that the intervention that we want to translate, 3HP, is approved based on randomized trials showing equivalent efficacy and better tolerability. We go on to say we describe some of that data and show that it's now recommended by the WHO as an option, and that it's a key priority for the WHO as well as PEPFAR. Okay, so we lay out clearly kind of what the rationale is that this evidence-based intervention is ready to translate. The conceptual model and theoretical justification. So I think a lot of people struggle with where to put this in an implementation science grant, or in a sort of an NIH type grant. I'm not sure that it needs to fit in one particular place, and since I'm always unclear, how to sort of put it in different places, I almost always create the first subsection of the approach section. Right? I write as theoretical base. I have this subsection with this heading there. Right? So everybody knows, and I call attention to the fact that we're using a framework, and this is what it is, right? And there should be no question then that this research is theory or model or framework based. And so for this particular grant, we use the behavior change wheel, and we provide a small we describe what it is briefly, and then a small rationale for why we selected this framework instead of sort of other frameworks. Okay, we go on to then within this section and others show how we're using the framework. So here, what we do is take the COM-B model from the framework and show how we think about the barriers to 3HP adherence based on the literature on barriers to adherence. So this is actually not information we collected ourselves. This is all just based on taking existing literature and synthesizing it according to the COM-B framework. And so what this does is, tells people that, we've reviewed the literature, we're knowledgeable about the literature on barriers to adherence, and we're able to conceptualize that within the context of a theory or framework. Okay. We then go on to describe how the framework influences our selection of interventions, and we did this by saying which barriers we're targeting. So of all the ones listed in this figure, right? These are the 9 within 3 each within capability, opportunity, and motivation that we thought we had to target. And then we show how we're targeting them. So this knowledge barrier related to capability, and this motivation barrier related, we're targeting with education and persuasion. These are the intervention functions. These are the specific behavior change techniques that are supposed to be useful for addressing those intervention functions. And then we say for both directly observed therapy and self-administered therapy, how exactly we're delivering those intervention functions and behavior change techniques, right? So what we tried to do here is to say that our goal here was to say both DOT and SAT are potential strategies. Both of them need to address the same barriers. And what we want to do is test when we address those barriers for each of these strategies, how do they compare to each other? And so you'll see that for each row, the same barriers are being addressed, and we're showing how we're doing it within both directly observed therapy and self-administered therapy. This grant had a third arm in the trial. We're also testing the concept of patient choice, so empowering patients to choose between different delivery options. And we show how we think choice will further enhance addressing barriers, right? That independent of these other things, we think choice will further allow patients to have better knowledge and to have better sort of motivation and increase some of their support by giving them the choice. So what this lays out for us is not, I mean, for the reviewers, is clearly how we're conceptualizing not only what the barriers are, but why we chose our various intervention components, and what we think, which specific barriers we think each intervention component is addressing. Right? This carries through to the evaluation section of the grant, where we then can go and say, you know, we're measuring each of these things and whether they're changing or not, to kind of get a sense of whether each component is useful or not useful as part of the implementation process. So ingredient 4 was stakeholder priorities and engagement. So here we say that in the significance section that, you know, these interventions, these implementation strategies were designed in consultation with stakeholders. Right? It's not something we made up. In the conceptual framework section, we say that that this was done in consultation with HIV/AIDS clinicians and programs leaders, and we also propose a process to further consult before we actually implement these interventions during the process during the first year of the trial to further refine them before implementing them. Lastly, you know, I think letters of support are an important way to show engagement. So for this letters, again, many in the room, so Jennifer, the executive director of MJAP, Professor Sevan Kambo and Professor Kamya, who are with the college and also with MJAP, all provided letters of support to show that this was an important priority for the program and for HIV/AIDS care in Uganda. Setting readiness to adopt services. So again, we're saying that this is a key priority for PEPFAR, for MJAP, and for the AIDS clinic, and again, using the letters of support to bolster our case that this is actually something that the program wants to move forward with, not just the researchers want to move forward with this intervention. Okay. The implementation strategy and process. And so again, in the approach section, we kind of start with some preliminary data showing that the interventions that we selected are supported by a substantial body of literature. So not only have we reviewed the literature to figure out which techniques might be effective, but we also have some preliminary data on our team about why these might be effective. We go on to then, you know, talk about the study context, that the key investigators on our team are part of the local study context, are part of the investigator and research team, including one of the co-PIs, Fred, as well as Drs. Kamya and Namusobia. And then for each of the key aspects of the trial, we lay out what our experience is to kind of justify that this is what the methods that we're proposing are feasible and that we have experience with them. In the measurement and analysis section, again, we describe clearly kind of what measurement techniques we're using and what their goals are, how we're going to collect data, and then how they relate back to some of the theoretical methods. Like, so if you take the process metrics for each of the various intervention components, we kind of define what the metrics are and how we're going to collect data on them. So people know that we're not, at the end of the trial, we'll be able to say whether each component was implemented as intended or it wasn't, and that might contribute to the effectiveness of the overall strategy. The policy and funding environment. So here, again, we emphasize that this is a key priority for PEPFAR and WHO. And in fact, WHO lists TB-preventive therapy as a core service of national AIDS programs. So all of our work is consistent with current policy guidance and priorities of key AIDS control organizations. So this was the second example is shorter, but I just wanted, this is a grant that Luke wrote along with Achilles. And what I wanted to highlight here is this was actually one of the first implementation science R01 sort of our group applied for. And this was, you know, before we learned a lot of these lessons from the 10 key ingredients. And so what I want to show you is kind of what the reviewer comments were related to the first submission. how they really reflect some of these 10 key ingredients, and then some of the changes we made to address the comments in the revision, which was then funded. So this grant you also heard about. Luke described it in his talk. It's about mobile health for implementation of contact tracing in Uganda. For those of you who don't know, the NIH has a specific dissemination and implementation research in health RFA. I'm not sure how long it's going to be open for, but they now have a specific study section that reviews grants submitted to this RFA. And so that study section contains a lot of people who have experience and expertise in various implementation science methods. And so it's even more important now that if you're writing such a grant and submitting it to NIH, that it meets some of these 10 ingredients that we talked about, because there'll be people on the study sections who are looking for those things. So this was the initial reviews from the grant, and as always happens, 2 reviewers, so in here, a low score is good and a high score is bad. 2 reviewers really liked the grant, mostly getting 1s and 2s and maybe a 3. And then there's always that one reviewer who, prevents your grant from getting funded, right? Seems to happen almost every time. So this 3rd reviewer, for whatever reason, had issues with a lot of the aspects. And so some of the key ones are described here. So they comment that the research design is rigorous and the recruitment plans are clear and analytic approaches are clearly articulated. But the panel expressed concern regarding the need for a mixed methods investigator on the team, the lack of detailed pilot data, and the need for additional PIs from the foreign site. The panel also commented on the need for a better articulated conceptual model and additional details in the resources component. So I think this is the part that I want to highlight in terms of, that this is something that they're looking for, right? You can't get away with writing an implementation science grant anymore without putting forward a conceptual model for the work that you're doing. So related to this, I just want to kind of go through how we improved or clarified what our conceptual model was. So this was the initial figure that we submitted describing the conceptual model for the intervention, other than these not being on the same line. So this is something called the PRECEDE framework. These are the 2 intervention components. Is it clear which of these barriers they're targeting?
No.
Okay. So I think that's one of the comments that stimulated the reviewers' concerns, is that it's not clear to them what we're doing. And is it clear kind of where we see these barriers operating along the processes and outcomes that are important: testing, diagnosis, and treatment? Are these barriers to all 3 of these, to 1 of these, 2 of these, 3 of these, right? It's not really clear how we think the barriers are operating within the process of contacts being evaluated, tested, and treated. Okay, I think those, to me, are looking at this now. That's what at least I would have said if I were reviewing this. I would have had the same sort of concerns. All right, so this was our first attempt at revising it. What do you think of this? Yeah, so I think again now, there is a little bit more data about what maybe some of these specific intervention components are and which kind of barriers they're targeting, but it's not clear whether they're predisposing, which ones we think are these, and how those relate to each of these processes, right? It's still, there's more stuff there, but it's still not clear how the whole process is linked. Which barrier is related to which step, which intervention component is targeting which barrier, and how, right? So you can't really use this to say, oh yeah, they're using mHealth to target, well, I'm not really clear, right? It's still not clear what they're targeting with this. So after many more iterations, I'm not sure that this was just revision 2, but for expediency, we got to this. Right, so now what do you think? Yeah, so at this point, you can argue with whether or not we've conceived it in the right way, but at least now you know that for us, we conceive these as being predisposing factors, and they affect whether or not a contact would come in for testing, right? And because of that, we're going to do 2 specific interventions, right, to address, and we think that these will improve contacts coming back for testing by addressing these barriers, right? You may argue then that, okay, well, those barriers might also apply elsewhere, and that's fine, but at least you know what we're thinking right now, okay? Same thing for diagnosis, right? We think the barriers there are related to the cost of transport to reach a TB diagnostic center, right? And so We're going to collect the sputum at home and give transport vouchers if they have to go back to the clinic with a positive diagnosis, right? So you know what interventions we're doing, what process it's affecting, and what barriers it's intended to modify, right? And same with the last column. So this at least gets to that same kind of diagram that I showed for the 3HP grant, where at least we're telling the reviewers how we think each of our interventions, where in the process of contact investigation it's intended to work, and what barriers related to that process it's supposed to target, okay? And so again, this gets, I think, much closer to what they're looking for in terms of how you go all the way through to conceiving of the barriers, to picking the interventions, and then back to evaluation. So to know whether or not these two things are working, we would measure these factors, or these behaviors, or these, barriers. Right? So to summarize, I mean, I hope going over these ingredients has been helpful. And overall, I mean, in the article, Proctor writes, applicants need to demonstrate the progressive nature of their research agenda and their ability to build cumulatively upon the literature in their own preliminary studies. And so, it is important to go through and show, either using the literature or your own work, why you're choosing the intervention strategies or the implementation strategies that you're doing. And we hope that the behavior change wheel is at least one systematic approach to satisfying the reviewer's curiosity or requirement for knowing kind of why you're doing what you're doing and how you're going to measure it.